This happened about 2 years ago, nearing the end of September. My aunt and her friend decided to fly up to New York from Panama to enjoy their mini vacation with my parents and I. Although many strange and paranormal experiences have happened to me ever since I was little, this event stayed with me and affected me more than any other experience. Here's the thing. Many things have happened to a lot of my family members, especially my aunt and her friend. We'll get back to that later though. So, it was around 10:30 at night. Keep in mind that my old neighborhood was a very calm and quiet place. Since I live near the countryside, not much action happens in the neighborhood. The neighbors were either elderly or young couples with smaller children. None that could have caused trouble around the neighborhood. There were only about 20 to 25 houses in the entire neighborhood that I lived in. Moving on, the three of us decided to stay up late to watch scary movies while my parents slept upstairs in their room. My aunt's friend was sitting near the slide doors leading to the backyard, while my aunt and I were sitting in the bigger couch near the front door. I was sitting on the left side where the door faced, and my aunt sat on the right side of me, which meant I was closest to the front door. We spent about 10 minutes debating on which movie we should watch. After those 10 minutes, we finally chose to watch Odd Thomas, which wasn't really a scary movie, but it was about a guy who could see spirits and demons. What a coincidence. We were only 2 minutes into the movie when I had a sudden urge to look at the door. I glanced back at my aunt and her friend, only to see them staring at the door as well. I looked back at the door for about 5 seconds, and then a loud bang came, and then another one, following after, and then a third one. All 3 bangs came from the front door, almost as if 5 people had just body slammed into the door 3 times. I thought it was going to fly off its frame. My first instinct was to run to the kitchen and grab a knife, but as I was about to do that, my aunt grabbed me by the shirt and told me to stay down. As I looked to my right, I saw my aunt's friend with her knees to her chest, rocking herself back and forth while my aunt just kept her gaze towards the door. While all 3 of us kept our attention to the door, next to it there were 2 small rectangular windows on either side of the door. The right window had a small curtain, and the left side was being covered with a small decorative tree. The small curtain had a gap in between of it because it was glued onto the window from the top area to the bottom area, leaving the middle part loose. At the moment of the bangs, it caused the middle area of the curtain to puff up slowly, and then quickly press against the window, leaving it wrinkled. After that, we were all silent. All of us were terrified. My aunt denied being scared, but at that moment, I could see nothing but fear in her face. I wanted to run upstairs to get my parents, but I was too afraid to go up the stairs because it was right in front of the door. All I could do was text and call them, but they were in too deep in sleep to even hear their phones ring. My aunt told the 2 of us to calm down and dismissed it as the wind. We all knew it couldn't have been, but in order to stay calm, she made up that excuse. And I must say that it was totally cliché. The next morning I told my mother about the previous events. She brushed it off by saying it must have been a bear or a deer. Another cliché thing to say. We both went outside to inspect and found my mom's decorations near the front of the door thrown off to the side. There were no scratch marks or bumps on the door. Everything seemed normal except for her decorations laying on the side. When the 3 of us looked at the door of the night of the event, there wasn't anything that could have caught our attention. Since the woods were 40 meters away from my house, we would have heard the trees moving with the wind, but we heard nothing. The movie was playing at the time, but it was strange how we all felt a sudden urge to look at the door, almost as if we knew that something was about to happen. The bangs were extremely loud and caused me to jump up from the couch. It couldn't have been kids playing a prank on us, because I'd been living there for about 3 years, and nothing like that had ever happened. Plus, I knew the neighbors well enough to know that they'd never do such a thing like that. There were exactly 3 bangs, one after the other. One could have honestly caused the door to fly out of place, but thank God that it didn't. What about the curtain? The only explanation we could come up with was that the impact of the bangs created wind, causing the curtain to react that way. But why did it inflate slowly if the bangs were rapid, and then suddenly cause it to go against the windows so fast after the bangs were over? My aunt thinks that the wind must have knocked it off its course. That's why we didn't hear the trees moving, and created huge columns of wind that must have caused the door to move so much. The gust of wind must have gotten inside the house from the cracks of the door, leading the curtain to puff up. Personally, it doesn't make sense and sounds like bullshit to me. She also mentioned that she saw a shadow outside, but she doesn't have an explanation for that. I didn't see a shadow outside though. My mother came up with an excuse as well. She said it might have been a deer or a bear. But why would a deer or bear bang their head or entire body for that matter into the door? Like I said, there were no scratch marks to prove it was an animal. No animal could have caused those 3 loud bangs. We've had deer sightings in the neighborhood before, but none that have acted in such a strange behavior. Usually, they would all run back into the woods. Bears are out of the question. Not once have there been a sighting of them. I should also mention that we had the lights from outside on. Why would an animal come on that close to a house, especially a door that is clearly being illuminated by a light? Like I said before, animals in general are out of the question. As I mentioned before, my aunt, along with my mother, have had experienced many unexplained events, and they believe in the paranormal. I think the only reason they tried to make up an excuse for this situation was to prevent me from becoming paranoid and afraid. It's pretty late for that now, since I've had my fair share of experiences as well. Now, to my aunt's friend, my aunt told me that when her friend was younger, she suffered from really bad night terrors. She said she saw things, demonic entities as she described them. She'd wake up screaming and crying. It was traumatizing for her. Her family had always been religious, and they prayed for her every night, and slowly, those things haunting her went away as she grew up. That really creeped me out and led me to believe she might have brought or attracted that thing to my house. Or maybe it could have been something else. I hope this never happens to me again. Please let me know if you guys think it might have been the wind that could have caused those 3 extremely loud knocks at my door, or an animal, or some kind of creature. I know they watch me. They watch me when I'm awake. They watch me when I'm asleep. I only see them during the day out of the corner of my eyes around the house. But at nighttime, they become so much more active. Sometimes they sit in the corner of my room and watch me as I lie there in bed. Other times, they walk around my bed, looking down at me. Other times, I hear them outside of my room, making groaning and growling noises, and other sorts of frightening sounds. I've been subjected to these beings as far as I can remember. It's why I feel like I've developed sleep problems. I've never felt safe in my own bed. knowing these things are around and can get me anytime. My parents are aware of them too, and know that they lurk inside the house. We call these beings shadow people. They look just like people, except they're dark shadows and silhouettes of human shapes with red, glowing eyes. I know they're around. I always feel a heavy sense of dread, especially when they're in my room at night. Other times, I can sense them in my closet. From an early age, I've tried to sleep with the lights on. Every time it's dark, I can feel the feeling of evil and dread grow and grow, and I can begin to feel their presence in my room. I know they thrive in the darkness. My parents have talked about seeing them, but they only really seem to reveal themselves more and more to me. They always have. They're drawn to me for whatever reason. I can't quite explain it. I'm even afraid to leave my bedroom at night and even use the restroom, because I know they lurk in the hallways and other areas of the house. There's also times where I wake up in the middle of the night and I could feel them standing right beside me, watching me sleep. I refuse to open my eyes and look at them. They terrify me so much. I'm almost out of high school at this point, and all I could wish for this once I move out, that they will stop terrorizing me so much and let me have peace. I live in Canada, and I live in Alberta, and I have had some freaky ass experiences in my home. Well, my whole family has. Examples of things that go on in my house are stuff like sleep paralysis, and things nowhere close to anyone being moved in front of us. Also, a whole bunch of creepy noises and things going bump in the night. My house is a very old trailer home on the outskirts of the city, and I'll give you the rundown about my family. My mom is a very religious woman, and is a believer in the supernatural, and a horror movie fanatic, I guess. My younger brother, who is 16 years old, is a very avid soccer player, and plays on Victoria, both the men's team and the U.18 team. This will tie into the story, so don't worry. About 2 months ago, in April, I was home alone gaming in my room, playing some Counter-Strike Go with a mate. Well, I had played for about 2 hours, and I was kind of sick of playing Counter-Strike Go, and I decided to turn my PC off and watch Netflix on my phone. Just as I started watching a new show, I found on Netflix I had heard some noises from the kitchen, for example, such as the cabinets were opening and closing, plus the dishes in the sink were being moved. This isn't unusual, since when my mom gets home after my brother's soccer games, she puts some of the dishes from the living room into the dishwasher and puts the clean dishes into the cabinets. Well, without thinking about it, how long my mother was gone for, which was relatively a short time, she wouldn't have even been home for another hour or two. I left my room to see something in my hallway, just standing outside of the kitchen, which connects to the hallway through a short corridor. As I focus on the thing at the end of the hall, I thought it might be my brother. Then I realized that it doesn't have a shadow on the wall behind it, which was weird, and this piqued my curiosity, and I decide to take a harder look at this thing. My heart goes into my throat as I realize it's like a shadow, like silhouette, made of wispy black shit. As I stand just outside my room, I think it shocked me so bad I don't even know what to do without even thinking about it. I open my room door and slam it behind me, fearing for my life. All I could do was think of doing was calling my mom and telling her what I just saw, and she just tells me to get the fuck out in those exact words, and I did. I open up my window, which doesn't have a screen, and hop out of it and book it to my friend's house. He lives about 2 houses down from mine, and when I get there, I tell my friend what happened to my horror, and he starts to go pale and begins freaking out and tells me about one of the times he was at my house for a gaming night, and we planned on him staying the night, which he didn't because of this. He began by telling me his story. He was going to go to bed on the living room couch, and out of the corner of his eye, he said he saw something in the kitchen that kinda looked like a figure made out of a black mist. He didn't tell me this because he didn't want to scare me, and he told me he was going to sleep in his own bed that night. I am still living in that house, and sometimes I still feel as if something is watching me. I hope that I don't meet that thing again. My grandparents used to own a farm. It's a farm that they bought together when they were married young and have lived on that farm their whole life. My grandmother passed away about 15 or so years ago due to a heart attack, and my grandfather never recovered from it. He eventually hung himself in his barn about 10 years after that, which would make it about 2014 when it happened. After that, the farm got passed down to my family. My parents didn't really want anything to do with the farm or the property. They said I could have access to it and do whatever I wanted. To be honest, I really didn't want anything to do with the farm either, and have only gotten the creeps when I got out there. I wasn't super close with my grandparents growing up, so I didn't know my granddad all too well. I remember it was about 2 years since he had killed himself that I finally went out there to check the place out, since his death. As soon as I pulled up on the farm, I can feel the thickness of what I can only describe as death, despair, and loneliness in the air. It was January, and it was a pretty clear sunny day, but cold. I distinctly remember walking around the farm and just feeling so off. The only way I can describe it is I had literally felt my grandfather's sorrow. It didn't feel good. Unfortunately, because my parents lived so far away, and he had really no one close to him anymore, many of his farm animals died of starvation, and much of them were left to rot in their stalls, chicken coops, and pens. I remember walking by the coop and smelling a stench, since many of the chickens had long starved to death and rotted away in their coops. The horses were the same. Some of them died and rotted in the pastures, while some died and rotted in the stalls. It was a disgusting sight to behold. I don't even think his body was really found for quite some time when he had died, and he was fairly decomposed. The only way they were even able to know it was him was to look at who owned the deed to the house, and then his body was later verified via his dental records. To reiterate, the barn is where he had hung himself, and that's the direction I was headed to. The closer to the barn I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. I was overwhelmed with the feeling of sorrow, despair, and dread as I approached the barn. I remember opening the barn doors, and inside seemed so much darker than it should have been. I felt immediate fear and dread wash over me. I could have sworn I saw eyes and shadows moving along the top part of the open barn. I would say the most terrifying part of all this, for me, was the noose that my grandfather hung himself with, primarily still in contact. Well, the noose part had been cut down when they retrieved his body, but the rope part was still hanging. This shook me to the core. What happened next was something beyond our realm of existence. It felt evil. It felt supernatural. It's like I was in a trance. The next thing I know, my legs start moving into the barn. I somehow felt drawn into the barn by some unknown source. I have no idea what it was to this day. As I stepped in more and more into the barn, the doors began to close behind me, and it got really, really dark. Unnaturally dark. Especially since there is a small window at the top of the barn letting in fresh air and a little bit of light. As soon as the door closed, it was like the darkness enveloped me and came alive. I felt like my skin was crawling. I began to see shadows dance around me. I felt a million eyes staring at me. The closest I could relate to what I was feeling was imagining being trapped in a large room with someone with a weapon, and that you knew they wanted and were going to hurt you, and the lights go out. Imagine being on edge like this and knowing you could be attacked any second. That's what my fear was like. Something was holding me in this barn, and I don't know what it was. Some time had passed, and in the darkness, I remember gaining control, as I can only describe. I ran out of the barn and slammed the barn door shut. I decided it was time to get the fuck off of this property, going back to the car. I had to pass the house to get to the driveway. I remember as I walked by, I looked in the windows and I saw these dark figures staring at me with red eyes. I felt sick. I was frozen in fear, but my legs were determined to get back to my vehicle. Evil was all around this property, and I needed to leave, now. I eventually made it to the car and took off. I called my parents later that day and told them I wanted nothing to do with the property, and it was their problem. They still to this day have done nothing with it, or have come to visit. Like I said, my grandparents didn't really have anyone they knew or were friends with or close to in this area, so much of their property stays abandoned and left as is. My parents still legally own it now, as far as I know. The property is just going to sit and rot, like much of the animals that lived on that farm did after my grandfather opted himself out. I don't ever want to go back to that place again. I used to roommate with my brother when we were in our earlier 20s. My brother was only 2 years younger than I, so after we moved out from mom and dad's, we thought it would be a great idea to get a shoddy little shack of an apartment together. Actually, we ended up scoring a duplex together, with the other duplex being vacant for quite some time. We got a pretty good deal on it, and it was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom with a decent-sized living room and bathroom. When we first moved in the fall, things seemed to go pretty good. I had just started a new job, and that was great. My brother was already working crazy hours at his job that he had, so we weren't home most of the time. It wasn't until a few months into living in this place that we began to notice and experience strange things. There would be times where we would both come home, and things would be moved around our place. It only got worse. Things escalated, and objects and things around the house were moved, doors left open, and even our mattresses being flipped, scratch marks on the door, etc. We had to call the police a few times because we were convinced there had been break-ins with the door being left open, etc. The police unfortunately couldn't find any signs of such, and nothing was stolen or taken from our duplex. It wasn't long after that when we started to hear strange noises in the other neighboring duplex. Sometimes it would sound like whispering. Other times we'd hear deep groaning sounds and other bizarre noises. There was a couple of times that I was convinced somebody was dragging chains or metal across the floor. It freaked me out at first, But then I suspected that there were homeless people living in it, and I began to put together all the pieces, and that's what's been going on, and they had been breaking into our part of the duplex. I had called the landlord and had him get the police to investigate further. They found nothing. No signs of any windows broken. No forced entry. No signs of anyone having lived there in years. This is where my gut began to twist, and I felt like I wanted to retch. Something was going on, and I'm not a paranormal believer by any means, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. The sounds in the other part of the duplex got louder and escalated to screams at nighttime, tapping on the walls, heavy thudding, and what sounded like someone wearing boots made out of concrete stomping around all hours of the night. There were nights when I found it incredibly hard to fall asleep because of this shit. After a few months of this going on, my brother and I decided we should do something, but we weren't sure what. That is, until one evening, my brother brought home a Ouija board and said, "Let's see if we can contact the people next door." This shined as a red flag for me. A Ouija board seemed like a terrible idea, but I was so desperate for answers, and I figured any sort of closure would help us. Plus, I thought if we could come in contact, we could just ask them to go away. It worked out in my head. Surely it could work in real life, right? Wrong. My brother had always been into this super paranormal stuff. He was a geek and had grown up that way, and was always into Bigfoots and paranormal and all that junk. I'm not surprised he picked up a Ouija board at all. We waited until a night him and I were both off at the same time so we could make this happen and find out once and for all what was going on. Friday night came. He had taken the day off work, and I was home after work. This was about 7 or so at night, early February, and we lit a few candles and let the house be totally dark. We set the Ouija board up and listened closely. Everything was quiet. No noises coming from the neighboring duplex. We began to place our hands on the planchette, and I let my brother lead and ask questions since he knew how to work this thing much more than I did. My brother said out loud, "Who is here with us in the duplex next door?" Nothing. No wind. No creepy sounds. Nothing. We sat there and waited for another minute in silence. My brother then proceeded to ask more questions. "Has anyone died in this duplex? Why do you make so much noise at night? What is your name?" Nothing. No sounds. Nothing. After all of this going on for minutes, I finally spoke up and I said, "I knew this was a bunch of bullshit. What are we?" There were no open windows, and just like that, I was cut off, and a cold wind chill blew out the candles. Along with the wind chill, we felt a force move past our bodies into the room. It wasn't even windy outside to begin with. There were no fans, nothing. No feasible way there could have ever been any sort of breeze come into the room like that, especially strong enough to blow out every candle in unison. It had a chill to it, an unnatural, evil chill. The force that came right along with it left us speechless and scared in the dark, just sitting there. My brother quickly pulled out his phone and shined his light. The planchette hadn't moved, but we felt something in the room we hadn't before. The room now felt heavy. We felt on edge, like something bad was about to happen. We quickly got up, turned the lights on, and got rid of the candles and the Ouija board with it. We didn't say much after that, and my brother got rid of the board. We decided we should just try this again tomorrow or something and go to bed. My brother agreed. I remember even my bedroom felt different. I had a really hard time falling asleep. I never felt a sensation so heavily before, but I felt like I was being watched, being stared at by hundreds of eyes. The lighting in my room was dark, but still dim enough I could make out basic shapes in my room. I eventually fell asleep, but remember waking up after having horrible nightmares. My eyes were adjusting, and that's when I turned white with fear. I saw several shadows standing in my small bedroom, by my bed, just standing there. I thought they were people at first, but these people were more black than the shadows and darkness itself. I had never been so terrified in my life. I laid on my stomach and buried my face in my pillow, waiting for them to go away. I eventually fell back asleep. This had gone on for weeks afterwards. We had never gotten the Ouija board back out. Me and my brother weren't talking as much at all. I could tell things were going on with him too, that he wasn't wanting to open up about. Turns out, not even a week later from the initial Ouija board experience, his boss passed away suddenly. He was then laid off from his job shortly after. Our mother was also diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer and had totaled her car in that week and a half since. Things only got worse at our home. I would wake up suddenly in a cold sweat to the feeling of being grabbed and trying to be pulled out of my bed at night. I would see these shadows standing over me, whispering into my ear a strange language I couldn't understand. A language I've never heard in my life. The closest I could sound it out for you would be something similar to whatever these shadows were that were infesting my room began to become more and more violent as time went on. I also want to note that during this time, and since the Ouija board thing, that I hadn't heard any sounds come from the other duplex since. It's almost like using that board somehow sucked whatever was in that duplex into ours. I had tried to talk to my brother and ask if he was experiencing any of these same things I was going through. He wouldn't talk about it though. My brother is normally a pretty chatty Cathy, and I've never been around him so mute before in my life. It's like his personality had changed and he wasn't himself at all. He almost looked ill. I can only imagine what he was going through at night. If I would have only known. Not too long after, I remember getting home at night, and he was in a dark place. He had taken a knife and was threatening to cut himself, and was hysterically crying, telling him the beings in his room were driving him mad, and they were trying to get him. They were trying to drag him to hell, and he wanted nothing to do with it. This was a total and complete emotional and mental breakdown. I tried to calmly talk to him and tell him to put the knife down. 3 hours into this, and he finally let go of the knife and kept telling me he needed to move out and get away. That with our mom virtually dying miles and miles away, since we lived in a different state due to our work at the time, so we weren't able to visit our mom. I told him we would look and see what we could do to break our lease early and get out. The next day is when it happened. You'll have to excuse me because this is tough to write. I came home from work, and the house was quiet. My brother should have been home. I knocked on his door but didn't hear anything, even though I called his name. I still didn't hear any sounds. Something in my gut told me to open his door, and I did. I dropped to my knees and began sobbing uncontrollably. So much so, I felt like a part of me had died right there in that very moment. My brother had hung himself on his ceiling fan with a blanket. He was naked and had what I can only remember as deep claw marks all over his body. The police came, and a note was apparently found that he had left before he died. They asked me if he had dealt with any mental illness or potentially schizophrenia. I told them never, and he'd always been normal up until recently when we had some things go on in that house. They didn't inquire more about that since they would have blown anything that sounded paranormal off entirely. I never actually read the note myself, and I have no desire to. But apparently I was told that he talked about being driven to the edge with these creatures taunting him, driving him to suicide. He said he finally succumbed and couldn't resist their allure. He was being taken to hell by these things, and that's where he was destined to be. I didn't even know how to feel about that. Days later, I couldn't cope anymore with everything going on. I broke my lease and left just about everything I owned there, and I flew back to be with my dying mother. This was about 14 or so years ago, just when flip phones were still big. It's still hard for me to talk about this sometimes, and I apologize for this being so long, but for me, it's a catharsis to write about this, no matter how hard it is. For those curious, my mother made it about another few months after I had flown back to be with her. I feel like her learning of my brother's suicide brought her closer to death. I feel like after that, she gave up all hope of living and beating cancer entirely when that happened. I almost opted out a couple times myself, but overcame luckily when I ended up meeting my wife and my life had changed. Anyway, whatever we did that one night brought those things into our duplex. The only thing I can look back and describe them were shadow creatures that haunted us. They apparently tormented my brother much worse than I. I wish I knew how bad it was because I would have helped my brother had I known. To anyone out there who deals with these beings, don't provoke them. Do whatever you can to get away from these demons.